All right, so welcome everybody. This is well, thank you for standing up. This is a great moment for us. It's our first event at FIU's CARTA Wynwood, and we're delighted to have Carlos Grenier, Professor of Religious Studies, here with us, and Amit Ranjan, who's Dr. Amit Ranjan, who's here, who's a special Fulbright scholar with the School of International Public Affairs. And what's so special about this is, well, there are a number of things. There's an amazing book talk, but this is kind of a second round. We're kind of re-seeing the world again through Dr. Ranjan's eyes with the questions from Dr. Grenier, and it's an opportunity for us to understand a little bit more about your research and your scholarship through this book. And you gave a lovely presentation of your previous work at the Miami Beach Urban Studios. So we feel very comfortable having you here and welcoming you back, and I'm delighted that you're with us and that we're all able to do this. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind words, for the very generous introduction. It was lovely reciting poetry and discussing poetry last time, and hopefully we'll have a great session today also.
I'm sure you will. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Carlos?
Okay, so I would like to give a little more detail on Dr. Ranjan's accomplishments and his background. Amit Ranjan is a Fulbright Scholar in Residence at FIU for this academic year, 2001 to 2022. He has a PhD in 2012 and a master's and an MA from JNU in Delhi, and a BA in English from St. Stephen's College in Delhi. His doctoral research, upon which this excellent book is based, is about John Lang, a 19th century Australian reformer, writer, lawyer, journalist that throws new light at the mid-19th century British Empire, vis-a-vis all the characters that come in and out of this fascinating individual's life. Dr. Ranjan was a Fulbright Scholar previously here as well. He was here in 2019, and earlier in 2015 and 16 he was also here. He has also been a recipient of the Endeavour Fellowship of Australia, a place that has connections to John Lang that we'll learn about soon, and was a visiting fellow at University of New South Wales in Sydney, along with many other honors. He has held the honorary position of Australia Awards Ambassador for 4 years, has taught literature at several institutions, and has published many poems, short stories, and essays in a number of magazines, all of which have very cool names. Amit has also written 4 plays, and his poetry collection was published in 2018 under the title Find Me Leonard Cohen, I'm Almost 30. Dr. Ranjan, as he describes himself, as someone who's always on the hunt for symmetries. And his latest hunt has taken him to the study of a 17th century Indian prince, Dara Shikoh, and he's at work on this book. He's at work on another collection of poems, as well as another academic work about colonial writers. Currently, he's also assistant professor of English NCERT in New Delhi. So that is a very long introduction, but it makes sense because Dr. Ranjan is very accomplished. To me now falls the task of trying to help expose what this book is about, and trying to, with the author's help, sort of explore the themes in this book. So the first thing I'd like to do, I'd like to ask Dr. Ranjan, is to simply explain a little bit about the biography of this book's main character, John Lang.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Grenier, and thank you for your long, generous introduction. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Grenier without looking at the thing, which is he did his PhD from University of Chicago and has deep interest in Ottoman Empire. His book also just came out, so hopefully we'll also have a book review by him very soon. And currently our shared interest is Sufism and the medieval world, and how the spiritual landscape sort of proliferated from West Asia to India, and so we'll talk a lot about those connections. And it may seem odd that we're talking about colonial India and Sufism in the same breath, but that's how it works. The connections are of course there, just waiting to be explored. So, all right, I forgot your question.
Who is John Lang?
Who is John Lang? John Lang is somebody I stumbled upon, as I have stumbled upon all of the things. John Lang is a character who landed in India because he was expelled from Australia, let's say. So Australia, as you know, was a convict colony in the late 18th century. 1788 is when Captain Cook landed on his ship Endeavour in what is now Sydney. And so there's a difference between free people and those of convict origins. And the convicts could be of any kind. You steal a spoon, you are sentenced to death, and it could be commuted to work in Australia. And so there was a difference between the free people and the currency people or the emancipists. And 90% of the people were, of course, emancipists who would work in the colony. And Lang was descended from this. And so it became a sort of caste system between the gentry and the emancipists. So he studied at Middle Temple, and even though he came from a wealthy family, he was treated like a currency lad and was fighting for the, let's say, more rights for currency lads and for Australia to become an independent country, independent of England. So he was duly expelled from Australia. This is not the place where what Australians say larrikinism works. So his brother-in-law was a judge in the Calcutta High Court and very wealthy. And so he thought India is the right place to make money, as well as to settle scores with the British gentry, combined with the Indian underdogs with his own underdoggedness. And that is what exactly he did in his career, which is pretty long. He spent fairly all of his adult life in India. So he's born in 1816, he studied in England. 1842, when he was 26, he came to India and lived till the end of his life, which is 1864. He died very young, 48 years old, but at that point of time, it's pretty old because most people kept dying of cholera and other epidemic diseases, mostly cholera and malaria at that point of time. And there's fascinating series of cholera and malaria research also tied into the John Lang saga amongst various other things. So his main thing was to harass the British government, call out the judiciary, call out the legal system. He himself was a lawyer and he had a facility with Urdu, Farsi, Hindoostanee. He was a polyglot and very fast learner of languages. So whatever he could learn in North India, he learned very quickly, and he could argue in lower courts with facility in Farsi within a year of his arriving in India. And so when I stumbled upon him, which is out of a different reason, I was not at all looking for John Lang. I was looking for somebody called Alice Richmond, a girl whose grave is in Pune University, and I was obsessed with this figure because of all kinds of myths that float. It's inside a university, so of course there'd be ghost stories, love stories, all kinds of stories. And I was obsessed with this figure to find out about her, which I did eventually. But I did what in the Ramayana mythology Hanuman does. So Lakshman faints in Ramayana, and he has to get Sanjeevani Booty, this particular herb from Himalayas, which Ram asks him to get. Hanuman flies there, is the monkey god. He doesn't know the difference between this plant and that plant, so he lifts up the entire mountain and brings it to Lanka, and tells Ram, here it is, take whatever you want. And so I had to do the same. I had to, I didn't know what the Australians were doing in mid-19th century in India, and so I just picked up the whole thing. Look at whatever Australians were doing in mid-19th century and see and maybe I find a lead to Alice, which I did, strangely through a poem mentioned specifically to her on the death of Alice Richmond, died 1882, Pune. So it's very specific, so I knew. But on the way I found John Lang. And when I started reading about him and what he wrote, this is a gold mine, and still mining. It's been a decade and more.
So there are many other episodes in John Lang's career that we'll hopefully have a chance to get to. But is it correct to say that you found John Lang because of your quest for Alice?
Absolutely, there's no doubt.
And so you set out on your project of researching John Lang, and it became a very personal thing for you. I mean, this book reads, less like a work of academic research, although it is rigorous, and more like a set of sort of personal encounters you have with all of the individuals who come in and out of John Lang's life. Can you talk a little bit about the process by which this book became personal, by which, at what point did he realize that this was going to be more than simply a work of academic research on a 19th century Australian and India?
Sure. So, as I understand, there are two parts to this question. One is, when did I realize that it's becoming personal, and the method of writing it, like I've written it as well. So, the first part is the moment I was associated with Alice. It's a sort of personal spiritual connection, let's say. I visit her grave in Pune, and I believe that Alice sort of controls my adventures, academic affairs, etc. It's a strange relationship. So I've sort of known it from the beginning that this is Alice-led. So that's one part of the thing. And about the writing itself, like you pointed out, it veers off from the regular academic sort of writing, which is conventional. And it is literary in its sensibility, but at the same time very rigorous. Everything is footnoted. So in this 500-page book, probably 50 pages are endnotes. And so it was a point sort of to make that historical writing need not be bound by the convention we've had in the last 50 years, which takes away from, let's say, the general reader gets intimidated by the word history, and they do not want to enter, which is basically a series of mazes and very interesting pathways which people don't want to enter because the conventional jargon of history writing stops you. So it was very interesting. I came back from Australia, lost an 8 GB pen drive with all the newspaper scanned on it, so which was a blessing in disguise, because then I would have an overwhelming amount of material, because there was other secondary reading and primary stuff and a lot of archiving work. So 1 month I was distraught. It was actually a bag was stolen, and in that the pen drive, it was a petty bag, so never carry a petty bag. And then I had this overwhelming amount of material with me, and it's primary research, never been done before. And before that I had done my MPhil, and now MPhil is sort of done away with in India, following the American convention. And to the American academia, I'd like to say, like, reintroduce the MPhil, because it tells you what not to do. You write your first draft in MPhil, a shorter thesis, you know what not to do and what you want to get rid of. And so it was a general atmosphere of talking about post-colonialism, subalternism, and those things, which is very fashionable in the academia. It's deep as well, but one can get complacent with it. And so I had done my MPhil on Amitav Ghosh and how he strategizes to write about violence, etc. But I exhausted him completely, almost a PhD length MPhil, because I wanted my romance with this particular writer and the idea of post-colonialism also to dissolve into something else, something bigger. And by the time I ended it, I realized that for my PhD I need something solidly archival that questions these theories, interacts with them, has a dialogue with subalternism, post-colonialism, etc., rather than just playing around with theories, which is the standard form that you quote Foucault, Derrida, Homi Bhabha, and use that formula to write your thesis. So that was the challenge, how to have a dialogue with these figures but not get consumed by them. And John Lang's story is so fascinating. So I spoke with my PhD supervisor, who is also a very important figure, let's say, because he's also very unconventional in his approach. And so it was my birthday, and there were just 4 months left for the thesis submission on April 10. And I said, we have this much material, I haven't written anything, what do you suggest? And we sat down with something from Malibu all night, talked about this and that, couldn't arrive at anything. In the end he said, I know what I have to tell you, which is this, that Pablo Picasso could paint realist portraits very well. There's no better portrait maker than Picasso. He made his portraits, tore them apart, and did what he did. That's what I have to tell you. And so I said, very well, I've got my answer. Then it will not be in 5 chapters, it will be in 50 chapters, 10 pages each. And that's how it will be, and without theory. My supervisor is a theorist, so do I teach literary theory mostly. But we decided to have zilch literary theory inside the book. And so there is none. It's a narrative, and it is how to narrativize, and narrativization itself is a theoretical apparatus. Storytelling as a theoretical apparatus. That's the idea, except that Foucault comes exactly midway in the book to crack a joke about madness and civilization, and that's it. And so it's a sort of an experimenting in history writing of how to use all the ideas that are there, all the philosophical ideas are there, but not let them come in the way of the story itself. And so that was the experiment, and thankfully I had a supervisor who dared to do that. So
structurally, this book is quite interesting to me. I mean, I was trained as traditionally in traditional history writing, so I tend to think of things chronologically. But in your work, you said you have close to 50 chapters. I'm not sure the exact count, but many chapters that are short and not necessarily chronological. Can you talk a little bit about how you organize this book structurally, and why you felt that was appropriate to the specific subject matter of this very gregarious, complicated individual from the 19th century?
So I don't know what my influences are. It's probably Arabian Nights, Alif Laila, Boccaccio, literally the frame narrative, stories within stories, and associations, one story leading to the other. So I didn't have a particular structure, except I followed the John Lang structure, a 19th century structure in which every book has alternate names. So 3 calendars or Jenny Day. So there'll be alternate titles always. So all the chapters have alternative titles. But I've gone with associations. So I've written the first chapter, and whatever else it was leading on to, I let myself be led onto it. It's probably an effect of Gabriel Garcia Marquez also, I'd say, because I read him a lot, and how memory and association lead to from one thing to the other. And they very intricately tie up as well. It's not that anything is left loose. It all comes back. You just have to follow the logic of that. So associated memory.
Yeah. So I want to turn back to the actual figure of John Lang a little bit, and try to familiarize him to the audience a bit more. John Lang moved from Australia to India and began this career in law, as you describe it, harassing the British government. Can you talk a little bit about any sort of conscious political or ideological agenda he might have? What was his sort of driving force in all of this activity that he participated in India?
Sure. So he studied the Indian administration very, very clearly, very lucidly, and it's not that he was harassing for harassing's sake. He knew the legal system in and out, and British Army in India very clearly. And in fact, it was very clever. He made money out of that, money out of the army wives, because he'd write these serialized novels, and these housewives would buy it, and they would gossip to him about their husbands, and that is how it was also a lot of military gossip through that. But the legal system, he is very tired of the protracted legal trials in India, because the British did not trust the Indian witnesses, so everything had to be written down. And so even till date in India, we have this saying, "Likh ke, give it to me in writing." Anything or main likh ke dunga. That if I have to assure you of something, I'll say that I'll give it to you in writing, which means that it's a legal bond. And so he talks about it, how there's endless reams of papers spent over nothing, because the British judges would not trust the Indian witnesses, so everything is written. And then he debunks it, saying that, this drunk, illiterate witness, even if you give it in writing, what does it matter? You'll get a thumb impression of him anyway. So basically, people who can write will manipulate the illiterate people, and that's what still happens, I guess. It's the colonial legacy. That's and so he also talks about character certificates, and so the modern letters of references or character certificates and these kind of things have origins in British colonies, and which is very insightful because one did not know where these strange things originate from. That you want admission into a university, they ask you for a character certificate. Like, what is character after all? That's the legal part of it. And he also talks about court martials and how ridiculous they are, and they go on for months. And it basically depends on the bias of the judges within the military of who they want to favor, who is from the British gentry, and so on and so forth. And the military, he gets even more hilarious and sarcastic. And so he'd point out at somebody and said, "Oh, Carlos Grenier, the Major General at age 35. How did he become a Major General? Because all his 4 bosses died of cholera, not because he has any talent." And all these wives had to vacate the barracks immediately if their husbands died. And so their widows would immediately marry somebody. They would be on the lookout for somebody to marry in case their husbands died. And in his novels, these dead husbands would come back, and there would be these duels between new and old husbands, and very hilarious situations in his novels. So obviously the British critics did not like what he wanted to write in his novels.
Yeah, so can we talk a little bit about his novels? In addition to being a lawyer, he was the author of 23 novels, some of which were fairly popular.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about the themes of these novels, what kind of characters they have, what sort of genres they fit into?
Sure. So most of them are set in India, except a couple in Australia for his memory of early youth in Australia and childhood in Australia, where also he makes protagonists out of convicts, not the other way around. And which is why he was not a popular writer in Australia as well. But they're largely set in India. They have a military setting. So one of the protagonists will go to the military, and a very, let's say, proto-feminist setting, because feminism was not a word that was used at that point in time, but very strong female characters. Will he marry her? Has this girl Leonora, and he also likes Lord Byron and Shakespeare a lot, so he takes names from Byron and Shakespeare, who is white in complexion. He meets her in England, and she says, "You will have to come to India if you want to marry me." And he does not know why he has to go to India, but of course he has to send somebody to India all the time to shift his novel from England to India. And half his characters in the novel say, about them it is said by the narrator, "England he despised, India he loved," about the main protagonist. And so this girl wants him to come to India if he wants to get married to her. He does. And she says, "It's only in India that you will understand who I am." Because she's a half-caste. Her father married an Indian princess who's dark. And her twin sister is dark, which he says black as an African. So he plays with categories of color, caste, and destiny. He sort of flaunts it to the Europeans. He says, "You won't understand. In your understanding, it's black and white. I know of 50 different shades of black, not white." And his Wilkie Collins also borrowed these ideas from him for one of his novels. But his female protagonists then are very strong. They control the narrative. Also because he was writing to a female readership all the time, which is very unlike mid-19th century in the 1850s when women were writing under anonymously or pseudonymously to be bold about writing about a divorced woman living with an unmarried guy, or one woman falling in love with 3 men who dress alike and then they look alike to her. It's called 3 calendars. So this is a subversion of a typical Jane Austen novel like Pride and Prejudice or something. So he was picking on both Charles Dickens, who was his friend and contemporary, on Jane Austen and several other writers of the 19th century. So he's outrageous in that way. And even though he himself went through a divorce, he has all sympathies for the female figure, and that's the point of view he writes from. So it's very interesting writer that way from mid-19th century.
So as a general question, he has certain themes he's preoccupied with, certain distinct ways that he presents these themes. How do you feel that these themes arise as a result of certain actual experiences he had? He seems to be very close to his fiction seems to very closely reflect his actual life in a certain way. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Also in the 19th century, there's very little line between fiction and non-fiction. There's nothing called non-fiction, and the memoirs are fictional because they're for a European audience, so you exaggerate certain things, exaggerate beauty, or romanticize the landscape, or brawls and things like that. And so there's so his Wanderings in India, for example, which are his memoirs, I suspect a lot of it is fiction. And similarly, a lot of his fiction is actually memoir. And he does very deftly and playfully. For example, I'll give a very good example of how he does this. So he knew Urdu that we know very well. So whatever he could not print in his newspaper, he would write that in Urdu, and the printer was the same. So he would leave that at the printer so that the Urdu newspaper, Jami Jamshed, picks it up. Any juicy story that he could not print in his own newspaper. So one time, the cops were looking for a criminal in a village, and the village wouldn't give him up. So they burned down the village. And a few people who he knew were involved in that. So he could not, one of his benefactors of the newspaper also probably was involved in that. So he couldn't write in his newspaper, but he was determined to write about it. So he writes it in Urdu and leaves it at the printer, and it gets published in the Urdu newspaper, Jami Jamshed. Now we do not know that he's done this, except when he writes it in fiction. He writes it fictionally. That there was this rogue Englishman who was weird and who knew Urdu and Farsi, and he betrayed his friends by writing this thing in Urdu and leaving it at the printers, and it got printed in Jami Jamshed. Oh, what a bastard, what a rogue. And he could be very phlegmatic and use all kinds of expletives very openly in his fiction as well. So in his fiction, he castigates himself for writing this thing in Urdu and passing it on. And so his readers who know him would know that he is responsible for that. And so the line that is blurred between fiction and non-fiction at that point of time, he uses very deftly to effect.
So you are researching all of this, and you're traveling between Australia and India, and I think you went to England for this as well?
No, I had to go to England, but I thought Australia would be better so that I can also trace some of his family.
So as a researcher, this must have been a quite complicated task. Different kinds of archives, different sources of data to piece together. So how do you think that, if we're thinking of you as the author, how do you think that complicated experience of putting together the book, did that make you relate to John Lang in some way? John Lang being a traveler, John Lang being a researcher,
Sure, I started feeling like John Lang at some point of time because I had stopped reading newspapers of 2010 and I was only reading 1854, 1855. So I had started speaking in Victorian English for a long time, and I was more aware of the legal system and the military of 19th century than the present world scenario. So it was kind of a schizophrenic scenario for a brief while, for a year when I was deep into this and inhabiting that. But yes, I realized that since, like I said, it's Alice led, and she's led me into this adventure to realize certain things about myself as well. That I like a similar sort of wandering career like John Lang had, and be an observer of the world, sitting by the corner, sipping on something. That's how he is. He's a painter of observations, and he's got deep insights, and also he's got a worldview of. And I think a lot of 19th century writers are aware of the ephemerality of the world without reading too much philosophy or whatever, because of so many people dying around that. And being aware of that, he keeps wandering across India also. He doesn't stay in Meerut or Mussoorie. He calls himself Muffasalite, which means a small town. So he chose not to stay in Delhi or Calcutta. Started his career in Calcutta, but he found Meerut and Mussoorie to be much more comfortable for a person like him to wander in and out like a cat and sometimes visible, sometimes be invisible. I thought that I was used to doing similar things, and also I share that sort of excitedness like him, as also that deep melancholia about the ephemerality of our universe.
So that sort of personal identification or connection that you have with John Lang really suffuses this book, and it's what makes it very different than a simple academic biography of John Lang. So I think now I'll give you a chance to read maybe one of the introductory sections of the book, in which you sort of establish your own connection with John Lang.
Sure. So the book begins with a letter from Mr. Lang, and the first paragraph is a takeoff from this novel called Beautiful Losers by Leonard Cohen. As John would remember, my poetry book is Find Me Leonard Cohen, I'm almost 30. Leonard Cohen was a failed novelist. He published 2 or 3 novels and a famous poet in Canada. They made a documentary on him, but all that was not enough. And so he became sort of a pop star, writing songs and stuff. So this is on the lines of how Beautiful Losers begin, where he questions the saint in various ways. And that's how I have begun with this letter from Mr. Lang. Sorry. To John Lang, ESQ, Camel's Back Cemetery, that's where he's buried, Mussoorie, India. John Lang, who are you? Are you 1816 to 1864? Is that enough? Are you, or were you, a writer, a translator, a journalist, a traveller, a wanderer, an emancipist, a gentleman, an Australian, an Indian, a British, a polyglot, an illegitimate son, an illegitimate father? He was both actually. A legitimate lawyer, a Jew, a Christian, an alcoholic, a philiac, the best friend of Lala Jyoti Prasad, brackets. Interceptor of this letter, please do not think that I am just playing around with words. He will answer all questions with a yes, except maybe the one about an illegitimate son. John Lang, let us play the game of can you answer in questions. You can see that I am good at it. I will ask a question, and you will answer in a question, and I will answer in a question, and so on. Whoever answers in an answer loses a point. But what's the point? You will answer in silence, and it is difficult to understand if silence is a question or an answer. They keep stressing in classroom these days, question the question, which seems like an answer to me, and read the silences. The first task is accomplished with this game, but the second, to read silences, I tell you, is a difficult one. Last year, just when the very hot summer was setting in my country, I ran away to the winter of your country of birth. Before going, I met a buffalo and asked her this question: are you proud that you're black, or if you were white, you would be wholly buff like holy cow? The buffalo did not answer. She merely chewed her cud and slid into the nearby pond, and I exclaimed to myself, Gai bhais pani mein, which means the buffalo has gone to the water. I told this story just as I have told you to a writer friend from America. She said that she loves India and that it is very convenient for her here because everyone talks in English, but that she feels incapacitated at the end of an interesting story because the punchline is always in Hindi. I translated Gai bhais pani mein as the buffalo has gone into the water, but it was clear to both of us that she was right. You learned this fact as soon as you arrived in India in 1842 from Australia. You grew up in Sydney, studied law in England, went back to Sydney, where your belligerence was no good for your career. And so you set sail for where the fortune was, India. You also learned Hindoostanee and Persian within 6 months, argued your cases in courts in these languages, and beat the John Company at its own game. That's what the East India Company was called informally, wasn't it? The company was named after you. You knew how to deliver the punchline in Hindoostanee. the black boy with blue eyes in one of your stories delivers the perfect Hindoostanee punchline to British officers, Khuda Lord Kare, which idiomatically translated would be, may God make you an English lord, but legitimately translated it would be, may God do God. A famous writer, so famous that even you would know her, and of course much more famous than you, asked a question, can the subaltern speak? She answered the question herself, but the answer was so long that it has taken scholars 3 decades to figure it out. It would be best to play the game of can you answer in questions with her, and perhaps question her with the question with can the subaltern not speak? Her question then would be, do you think the answer is yes? My retort would be, do you think the answer is no? This would exhaust all the questions, and exasperated, she would answer in yes or no. You see, this is how you score points in the game. And given that her initial question is the basic question, and her final answer is the basic and the only answer, she would have answered her question with one word, and that would save us a lot of work.
So that can sort of give you a flavor of how personal and how deeply literary this book is. It's anything but a simple biography of an unjustly forgotten 19th century figure. One topic that I'd like to bring up maybe is John Lang's relationship with other writers. So many of the people that come in and out of his life are other writers, some of them famous, like Dickens, some of them less famous today, like Crawford and others. And you yourself use, one of the trails you follow throughout this book is the trail of literature. The way his plays and his novels influence other plays and novels and vice versa. And in this book, are you saying something about the way literature sort of created this connected world that he was a part of? Just talk a little bit more about the literary world.
Sure. So again, there are 2 parts to this question as I understand. I'd like to answer in 2 ways. One is, it was a revelation for me. We talk generally about history being fictional, fiction being historical, and we tend to talk about it psychologically. With John Lang, a very deep study of him made me realize that it's actually materially manifests. There are many things in John Lang novels which actually happened in his life or some other people's lives, like the exact things, which is kind of crazy. I'll give you a couple of examples. In one of his novels, I think it's Will He Marry Her? Yeah. Augustus Reckless fights the battle, Indo-Sikh Wars between 1840 and 45. And his brother gives him a bottle of whiskey and a Bible and some other things, maybe a knife, when he's going to the war, and he gets shot in the battlefield. The bullet pierces and stops short by 20 pages of the Bible hiding in his breast pocket. Now, Lang is deeply connected with Rudyard Kipling. Kipling never acknowledged Lang, which I'll talk about in a second. Kipling writes nearly 30 years after Lang, and Lang was very famous in India, so there's no way Kipling did not know about him. There's resonances between their work, especially Kim, which made Kipling's career. Kipling has also acted in a John Lang play without saying it's a John Lang play. And so that's the kind of injustice history has done to Lang. But this is what happens later. Actually, in the First World War, this guy called Maurice Hominy is fighting in the First World War, carrying a copy of Kim in his breast pocket, gets shot, gets saved by exactly 20 pages. And so he sends it to Kipling Library or the Kipling Society, saying that I want to donate this book to you. And they say that we'll give it back to your son when he's of age and tell him this story. And this is exactly what happens in one of John Lang's novels. So it's strange how these kind of things come together. Or Bernard Shaw. Shaw is somebody who recorded his life meticulously from childhood. So he's the most known author. Like there's daily journals, daily thoughts. The first play he saw is a John Lang play, Plot and Passion, which he does not again mention that it's John Lang. It's very strange. And Bernard Shaw refuses to leave the theatre. He thinks the play has not ended. Plot and Passion is constructed that way. John Lang is that kind of a writer who builds up a whole plot, gets bored and collapses it. So when it ends, you're still hoping that there's something more going to happen, but he's pretty much killed half the people, and that's the end of the story, much like Quentin Tarantino. So Bernard Shaw, as a 9-year-old child, does not want to leave the theatre. And in one of John Lang's novels, Eva Merridale, or Ex-Wife, so there's alternate titles to everything. So in Ex-Wife, this boy goes to watch a play with his uncle, and the curtain goes down after 3 acts and he refuses to leave. And so it's strange how the exact same things, in which Lang novels are much before these things happen, like 60 years, 70 years before these things happen. So it's strange how fiction manifests in reality in some way or the other. There are events floating upon ether which some people are able to catch. I think Marquez is very good at this as well, which is why we call it magic realism, but he said it's just real. This happens every day in Colombia. What are you talking about? That's one part of it. And the second part of the question I forgot again.
I think you answered most of it. So we could continue talking about literature, but I think one thing that
I remember it now. So it was about the literary whole scenario and his connection with other writers. So he's very close to Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is a very important figure. He comes from the working class. He does not care whether he wants his name to be there. He is becoming the gentry. On the other hand, gentry does not work for profit. Gentlemen does not work for profit, so they cannot put their name to anything they write. Nobody should know they earned a few pounds for writing a story. So everything goes in anonymous in Charles Dickens' novels. He does not lie. He just publishes everything anonymously with the editor as Charles Dickens. So everybody in today's world think this entire volume of work has been written by Charles Dickens. It's only a fourth of the work that is Charles Dickens's. The rest are his correspondence. And Lang is his chief Indian correspondent. And the funny thing is, Dickens never went to India, but Lang's storytelling was so powerful, and Dickens himself is such an imaginative person that there's a description of a party where Dickens matches Lang story for story about India, and then Lang learns that Dickens has never been to India. And that was the kind of facility Dickens had. So Lang wanted to become the sort of Dickens figure or overtake him, but of course Dickens knew how to play his cards well. He was also subversive, but within the limits of what social realism would permit, and not as outrageous as Lang calling out military and the legal system and racism and everything. Another important writer, of course, we've talked about Rudyard Kipling. In a way, it's good that Rudyard Kipling's name is not associated with Lang, because he's the exact opposite. By 1930, Kipling was completely discredited in the world for being a thorough imperialist. His close friend was Cecil Rhodes. He wrote paeans for him when he died. He did not write a poem for his dead daughter, but for Cecil Rhodes, and he thought that America and Germany together could rule the world, make a new world, and so on and so forth. So he's sort of preempting the world wars in a way. And so by 1930, everybody knew how much of an imperialist Kipling is, which is later in his career. He's more towards realism early in his career. But Kipling's taken the first half of Kim from Lang. It's a very similar plot. Lang often talks about Anglo-Indian children, mixed parentages, and their destiny. And the second half of Kim is taken from Frances Marianne Crawford's Mr. Isaacs, which is also a fascinating story of this Turkish slave who comes to Bombay, gets a rupee from the judge, and then becomes a millionaire and can pass off for an Afghan, a Turk, a British, or an Indian, depending on the dress that he wears, and is on a Buddhist quest as well. And so all these elements you see in Kim, if if you read it. And so clearly the influences are of Lang and Marianne Crawford, who's a very interesting figure, an Italian who lived in India and eventually was American for the later part of his life. So was Kipling. So there was fascination for America also, both India and America at this point in time, which is strange, old world and the new world. There's also Wilkie Collins at this point in time and a bunch of other writers. Wilkie Collins is also very interesting. I'm forgetting the name of that particular novel. Moonstone is what he's best known for. But this novel has a white girl in love with a white British military officer. And he has an accident, he has to be amputated. And so mercury was the go-for medicine at this point in time. And some mercury medicines could turn you a shade darker. Wilkie Collins takes cue from various John Lang's experiments with color and says the man turns black after having the mercury medicine. The girl is blind from birth, but she breaks up with him because now he's black. And so that is Lang and Wilkie Collins' way of telling you what racism is, that it is completely blind and Lang, so Wilkie Collins and Lang also work closely together. And Lang also makes a lot of fun of this business of color. And he says, oh, you don't know, Indians can be fairer than Europeans, darker than the Africans. It's thousands of years of mixing up. Like I said, he liked to flaunt his knowledge of India. And so there's this host of subversive writers, of which Lang is a part. And not just subversive writers, he's also associated with Freemasons, mesmerists, pseudoscientists, all kind of interest, because at the core of it he was a newspaper man and he had to get the most interesting stories out.
So, as you say, Lang was forgotten much more quickly than you would expect, considering the enduring fame that Kipling had. What was the afterlife of John Lang in, number one, literature, and number two, his actual progeny, his actual family, his legacy in India? How is he remembered, and either by his actual descendants or today in India at large?
Well, his actual descendants know they are his descendants. Yeah. I had to tell some of them that they are his descendants. Mostly in Australia. His mother remarried into Joseph Underwood family, which had 14 children, and none of them, because he did not even go back for his mother's funeral. They had some kind of a spat, or he was too much in love with India. He thought his mother is dead anyway. Why should he go? So he never went back to Australia. So the Australians sort of reclaimed him after a 1960s project to reclaim John Lang as the first Australian-born novelist. But that project by John Earnshaw and Colin Roderick was merely about digging his Australian roots than all the things that we are discussing. So they are interested in him only as the first, let's say, Australian-born novelist, to get the firsts of Australia right. It started in 1788. If you want to start with this version of history. This is very different from the 50,000-year version of history that Australia actually has. His wife divorced him, Lucy Lang, and went back to England. They had 2 daughters. This is also something new. I found a lot of new stuff. So everybody talks about 3 children in history, whoever has research on this. I found the 4th as well, who was involved in the Crimean War as a trumpeter, as a young lad or something. So I have that picture in the book as well. Both his daughters married into Italian nobility, which is what I was able to trace down to the present day and meet Monique Riccardi Cubitt, who's married into that family, and now her husband is dead and that family has disowned her, and so on and so forth. But I've met her in France, almost missed my flight 5 years ago. So and she did not believe that. She thought I'm just cooking up some fiction, so I had to show her a family tree, which took a lot of months to trace. I had to work very hard to get this, and then they did a good job of it in print. I wanted them to use my handwriting, but it's in print in the book. I was able to decide. It's also a fascinating history. There are lots of suicides, fights, murders also in this family history. But his two daughters married into Italian nobility, and one of them, following his legacy, became a writer. She wrote about Luca della Robbia, the very famous Italian sculptor, and a very authoritative book about him. But after that, his legacy is lost in Europe, it's lost in Australia, it's lost in India, it's lost everywhere. It's primarily because a writer's afterlife is dependent upon his critics. But I'm not pessimistic on this front because Shakespeare was dead for 300 years. It's only romantic poets that rediscovered him. It's John Keats that brought Shakespeare back to life. And similarly, so there's been a gap of, let's say, 100 years with me and some other people getting this back into. So it's earlier than Shakespeare got resurrected. He got resurrected in 100 years. So it's probably till early 20th century that he was known. Because his novels were fast-paced, they sold at the railway stations. So an Australian traveller in 1903 says that, Lang novels sell at Madras railway station. But thereafter, he sort of lost in this 1960s project about him in Australia. And this is primarily because it's written on the wall. He said too many bad things about the British Empire. So the British critics called him a hospital bed novelist. And that he treats the empire as a hospital bed and nothing else. And so it's lost to the British. The Australians, because he wrote about convicts, also did not live there. So it's easy to forget him there. Indians should remember him the most. Which they remember, historians of India only remember him as a British lawyer who wrote one-page account of the Ranee of Jhansi, who was the prime figure in the War of Independence of 1857. So that's the only thing they know about him, his one-page description about the Ranee, where he, in his usual manner, is flamboyant, flirtatious, and which has also given rise to a lot of speculation that there was a love affair between the Ranee and him, which is ridiculous. He met her only once and lost the case within a week because the court was determined to humiliate him. He had just won a huge case of nearly 4 million rupees for his client. And to give you some perspective, now a dollar is 70 rupees. In 1935, a rupee was $4. And so you can imagine what it was like in 1850 when the pound and the rupee were roughly the same thing. And so they were determined to humiliate him, and they managed to send him to the jail as well, as also defeat him in the case of Ranee, because they just made a new law, doctrine of lapse, that if you did not have your own son, you would lose your empire. So if the law states that, you can't argue much about it.
So I think now would be a good time for you to just freely show us some images that you have related to John Ranee.
So this is the family tree, which is difficult to read from here, and it's a lot of complicated stuff. This is Fisher's Ghost Festival, which happens in Campbelltown, north of Sydney, every year, first weekend of November, if I remember right. Now this is a story, a John Lang concocted story out of actual events. There was this man who was hanged to death for his neighbor's murder in 1826 or something. And so this is a very famous story, the George Burrell trial. And it also ties into phrenology, the obsession of that time. And at some point of time, scholars of the time were saying that phrenology is the next big discovery after telegram. And so skulls were shipped from convict colonies like Tasmania to India to Britain. And the headquarter of all that, can you take a guess where it was? The headquarter of phrenological enterprise in the mid-19th century? Philadelphia. Dr. Morton. And so, skulls were like gold. The more they traveled, and the more stories you added to them, it would generate more currency. So what would originate in Tasmania as a 10-pound skull, by the time it reached Philadelphia, it was a $2,000 skull because of the stories that would be added on the way. And so cannibalism would be added, that he was not just a common criminal. We saw him eating a hand or something like that. So phrenologists' interest would be prime in measuring the head for criminality, for things like that. And so Lang added to this trial, and probably George Morale's head was used for phrenological purposes, he added a ghost, that a fisher's ghost, the murdered man's ghost, pointed out to the pond where his body was buried. And since then, everybody's seen Fisher's ghost. As it happens, you tell a ghost story, everybody starts seeing the ghost. And now Campbelltown has a whole Fisher's Ghost Festival. But unfortunately, here also they do not know that John Lang is sort of responsible for this myth of Fisher's ghost. This is Andrew Thomas Peterson, John Lang's brother-in-law, who's also a colorful figure like him. There's this book called, which has an endless name like many 19th century books, called Letters Told to ATTP through a sensitive WL, conducted through seances, etc., etc. It's got a page-long title, which basically he conducted planchette or seance through this tramp he caught on the street and gave him a little money and made him the medium, and made people from Pythagoras and Aristotle through Julius Caesar to Lord Clive to John Lang, Lala Jyoti Prasad, all these characters speak through the medium. So it's basically ATTP's version of world history, speaking through a planchette. And it's also 600 pages long. It's my favorite read. I just leaf through it at any page. That's one of his projects. He was a firm believer in concrete. So he built the Sway Tower, challenging, it's a sort of a challenge that this would not sway. So it's called the Sway Tower, 218 feet long, without any reinforcement, completely of concrete, only of cement. It still stands in Sway. It was sold sometime in the 1950s. It's there in the book as well. He was interested in malaria research, in Freemasonry, in occult, all sorts of stuff. And he was the judge of Calcutta Supreme Court. This is the first literary work of John Lang. It's not handwriting, it's one of those lithographs in 1835, and he was still in school. And yeah, this is one of the Latin poems that he translated. And this is a dog being fed a mercury medicine, much like in Wilkie Collins's novel where the protagonist turns black. So mercury was quite in vogue as medicine at this point in time. This is one of his novels, Captain MacDonald or Bailiffs Outwitted by John Lang, and which shows how anti-Semitism has been a sort of a European thing for hundreds of years. You can see the representation of bailiffs, but it's a very funny novel aside from that. This is his grave. It's not a picture I have clicked, it's a picture from 1960s because I've never been able to find his grave despite trying 4 or 5 times, and I never want to find it. I'm afraid that I'll find it if I go to the cemetery. Many people have seen the grave after the publication of my articles over the last 10 years, and Ruskin Bond is a famous writer who found his grave in the 1960s, and there's been some chatter in the last 5 years. So lots of people have seen the grave except me. This is from where the book's cover is taken. This is John Lang's illustrations in his newspaper, the Mofussilite, self-illustration. So can't see clearly, but he also calls himself Scrooge, after Uncle Scrooge, the Donald Duck character, quite deliberately so.
So he drew those?
Yeah. And so these have been reworked for the cover by an artist called Sadhvi Java, who is based in India.
And what's it say on the top?
The Mofussilite, the small town.
That's small.
Yeah?
That's small one.
Small town.
Oh.
Yeah. This is his death certificate, 20th August 1864. This is all the primary archival work I did, and this is his wife's case against John Lang in the court for retrieving alimony. This is his mother, Elizabeth Lang. This is his childhood house in Ashwin Park, where a big Hare Krishna temple is now. This whole complex is broken down, and not on this estate, but one of the oldest buildings is the Hare Krishna temple now. And this is an illustration of what the house looked like. This is his mother's grave, and that's the best John Lang picture. He gets 3 of us in that picture. This is Nana Sahib. So this we did not go through because I go through this in pretty much every talk. So I'm bored of it, but this is the most interesting story. Nana Sahib is one of the fighters in the First War of Independence, or the Great Mutiny. A prime villain for the British, a prime hero for the Indians in mainstream history. John Lang treats him very differently, gives him a character certificate, and says he has very European ways. The tables turn with the doctrine of lapse, and he becomes a rebel. So both the British and the Indian picture are way off the mark from anecdotal sources of that time. That's him with Nana Sahib when he went to visit him. And this is a very interesting picture. So Lala Jyoti Prasad, whose case he won in the court, was this wealthy merchant who had provided provisions to the British in the Anglo-Sikh War, and instead of paying him up, they charged him with forgery, and that's the case he fought for 4 million rupees and won for him. And this is also a very funny, dramatic case in which a night before the judgment was pronounced, a soldier writing in 1893, William Forbes Mitchell, says that John Lang was no teetotaler, and his favorite brand was John Eggshaw. Upon John Eggshaw, John Lang was asked, "What do you think of the jury?" And he said, "They are a bunch of damned sewers, pigs." And so his friend said, "Can you say that in court?" "Of course I can say it in court, with or without John Eggshaw. See me tomorrow." And the next day in the court, he said that he came aboard the Nile, on which they served the passengers very bad stale pork, and this part of the case in which you have slapped this case of forgery on Lala Jyoti Prasad, pointing out to each jury member, this part stinks like the hind leg of the pork, this smells like the pork rib, and so on and so forth. So he pointed out to each jury member, called them all pigs, and the Judge Advocate General said he was ashamed to have been associated with this case at all. So he had won the case and the bet, and Lala Jyoti Prasad gave him his portrait, and that was his good luck charm. So he carried it with him everywhere. So when he went into a competition with Dickens, because copyright was a big issue at that point of time, you had to be present personally to get things copyrighted. His works were already being stolen by a person called Tom Taylor. So he had to be in England and also close to Charles Dickens to compete in being prolific and also get his stuff copyrighted. So while he was in England, mutiny was happening in India, and the British newspapers were looking for what Nana Sahib looked like. Nobody had a picture of him. And so everybody thought it must be John Lang has a picture of Nana Sahib. He must have. And so they went and saw this portrait. The illustrator, John Lang, said, "Well, this guy resembles Nana Sahib only as much as you resemble the Queen, so don't take that." But the illustrator nonetheless took it. And so this is what is in history books currently, even now, as Nana Sahib, but this is Lala Jyoti Prasad. And Nana Sahib's followers were distraught that, oh, a warrior, he does not have a pot belly like this man, he looks much more handsome, what have we made of him, etc. Lala Jyoti Prasad himself went into hiding, lest he be hunted down, for he was wanted dead or alive for a couple of 100,000 rupees. And so this is one of the hilarious episodes in the John Lang saga, and Lang avoided Lala Jyoti Prasad like plague thereafter, and they fell out also because Lang was a subversive, and Lala Jyoti Prasad, despite having won this case, went back and served the British military and gave provisions again. And in fact, I have found his descendants as well, living in Canada, and the methodology was strange. I emailed some people with the surname Prasad, and it's a Caribbean thing. That spelling is lost to India. Now they have corrected the spelling to the pronunciation, so they've lost the British spelling. But in the Caribbean and in America, they still use that spelling, Persad, instead of Prasad. So I emailed some random Persads in America, and it turned out we're talking about Jyoti Prasad. I emailed a Modi Prasad. That it rhymes. Let's email this guy. Turns out he was a faculty at some university in US and there was a lawsuit against him. So he thought, I'm the subterfuge of the establishment to get some info out of him. So he was very scared. And after a couple of emails, he didn't reply. He said, I don't know who you are, why are you asking these questions? So these are harmless questions. We are talking about your 19th century ancestry, but he thought I am somebody who's digging in for some information. So yeah, this is the most interesting picture in the book actually, because it's still in the history books. This is one of, let's say, innovations of 19th century magic mirror, magic lantern, where the person would be under the stage and their image, the phantasm would be projected onto the stage. And there's some kind of a story where Akbar the Great appeared on the road like a phantom in 1857 and said that the British will win this war. And Lang conjectures that, oh, it's Lala Jyoti Prasad doing this trick, he's hiding somewhere underneath the stage and projecting himself as Akbar or whatever. Both of the claims are preposterous, but nonetheless very interesting sort of a device, theatrical device that they used in the mid-19th century. This is his newspaper, which often had poetry on the front page, which is good food for thought. Now we don't have poetry anywhere on any page in any newspaper, for that matter. And this is also one of his feminist novels, Will You Marry Her, which we have already talked about. This is a cemetery where I couldn't find him, so I found myself. This is Lady Sale. And this ties into the history today. This is the Afghan campaign of the British in 1842, where literally everybody died. There were 10 people left to tell the story. And one of them was Lady Sale. So nobody's ever come back alive out of Afghanistan. That is the moral of the story. If anybody had asked historians, they would have told anyone not to go into Afghanistan. This is Lady Sale's picture, and she has wonderful memoirs about that war, a very anti-war perspective in 1842, which is also rare. 19th century is very special because everybody wrote everything. Housewives, military men, anybody on the street wrote something if they knew how to read or write, and also there's time for prolific publishing at this point in time. That's also Lady Sale, and this we've seen already. Yeah, I think yeah. And this is Alice's grave in Pune. This is the best place to end.
So I think before we finally finish, I think this would be a good chance for you to read the poem with which you close this book and
sure.
sort of meditate on John Lang and also Alice that took you to.
So there's this poem which I also end the PhD with, and also the book with, which is dedicated to John Lang and Alice Richmond. And they never met. They don't have any other connection apart from this connection that I have. If die I will, which I will not. Will, if I die I will, which I will not. It's my will. And strange, there are 3 wills in the first 3 lines, and that's my bestie there, who's also called Will. If die I will, which I will not. It's my will that I be given a grave, so that 150 years later, some wanderer spots an old wanderer not at his best, ignominiously at rest. If die I will, which I will not, it's my will that I be given a grave, so that 150 years later, some wanderer spots an old wanderer not at his best, ignominiously at his rest. Like I spotted Alice. The stupid epitaphist behaves like a typist and does not mention if her cheeks were like rose, but says she was born at Melrose. Died in 1882 at this very spot, died of cholera. They never write that on soldiers' graves. A poet says she died 4 years before. The epitaphist wrote his choleric prose about dates and Melrose. Poor Alice, rich man. Graves do lie, or how else would Keats's name be writ in water? Or is it why they say stone wash? Alice's ghost refuses to tell more, but hangs around and takes me to Landor's ghosts, Hills, thunder, rain, dark nights, perfect to raise a toast to a ghost of a Mephistophelites. The young barrister ran away from Sydney as if drunk upon the verses of Sir Philip Sidney and his huge desire. The gale of sea done, he had to face the ire of Raj Babus and sea, jail and dungeon, for he shook them a little with his words and letters. Cicero he wanted to be and barely knew fetters. The Ranee of Jhansi gifted him with a portrait, for he unsuccessfully defended her sealed fate. Once he saved a child from the seas wild, but the seas of time have quite drowned the man, and the name is indeed writ on water. He could not become Dickens, but his poetry about Jenny Dale and her name all around in the gale tells a very old tale of love. He lies in Camel's Back Cemetery. Camels store water in their back. Alice and John did not know each other, but their graves do. Thank you. The book is available on various online platforms as well as in bookstores. Not as much as in US, but in India, but here it's available largely online.
Thank you, Amit.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks so much for coming and participating in these rants and memories of adventures. Much honored.
No, that's amazing. And I really, it's so interesting. I think the afterlife is really interesting because we're kind of living with the book, and I was hoping you'd get to the, how did you find a publisher for this? Intense weirdness. Because it's so interesting, but it's so hard to convey complexity to a publisher who wants to know, okay, how much is it going to cost me to produce the book? How many images are there? How many sales copies are you going to have?
Well, I had to go through all of that. That's a very good question. That background should also be known. So actually, this book was 170,000 words in its inception. And the publisher said, cut it down to 100,000, but not right away. They sat over it, let it ferment, brought it to 6 months by the time I was deeply in it. And then they said, we want 100,000, not 170. So once it's a committed relationship, you can't get out. So editing it was much more tough, you can imagine, than writing it, because it had to be edited in a way that it sounded the very way it had been written. So it's been sort of written twice over. And Dr. Grenier says I should get it published, the full thing, double this size, somewhere in US. So if anybody is hearing, most welcome to approach. But you're right, also the weirdness. First there was a publisher called Juggernaut in India, who I sent the manuscript to it, and they called me for an interview, and they said, we are fascinated with your eccentricity, and your voice as a writer, but we cannot quite take in the eccentricity of John Lang. Nobody knows him, he's not Charles Dickens or somebody that we can sell. So why don't you write about some great Mughal? That's the connection between Mughals and the 19th century. I say I'm not an ad hoc writer like that, but I can write about Dara Shikoh, who could have been a Mughal and who is not a Mughal, whose brother got killed, else he would have been king. And I was deep into Dara Shikoh research at that point of time, courtesy my last outing to FIU, so FIU also has a role in it, because I was affiliated with religious studies over here. So John Lang gave me a contract for Dara Shikoh with Juggernaut, which also went sour because they did not like my way of deep references, and they said you can keep it minimal like today's writers keep pop, and I said no, I need, if it's history I need to know every mysterious detail of it. If you want me to write fiction, it's another matter. So finally that book is now coming out with Penguin next year. But yeah, the processes of publication are also on the other side very harrowing and very intense to meet the demands, like cut the book down to half, because somehow the marketing guys believe, and I want to go to those marketing schools and rant against them, that they believe that 1 inch is the psychological length which a reader can take. 500 pages, 1 inch. So I said, wherever you did this research, however you came up with this figure, but I don't know if readers agree with that or not. If the book is fatter, people leave it. They do not buy the book. And also, I went through a lot of pricing issues. I went with a trade publisher because I wanted to be accessible to people, also to students. Apparently, due to COVID, it's slightly higher price because paper is short or whatever. So we are still struggling with these issues. Kindle format has still come out. And so this part goes unacknowledged while talking about the book. The whole process of it also is very consuming for a writer, the compromises that you have to make.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can you talk about the cover of your book?
Sure. So the cover is
or textile?
sure.
I mean,
Cover
right,
is from
about
John
textile.
Lang's own newspaper. His self-portrait from his newspaper called the Moffisilite. And so I proposed this because there are no pictures of John Lang, despite the fact that there was daguerreotype at this point of time already. There may be his pictures, but his property is lost. So what we have is only public documents, not his personal letters and artifacts. So this is the best we have about him, and this may also be fictional. A researcher who I worked with in Australia thought he was short because that particular person wanted to equate Lang with Napoleon, so wanted him to be short, but probably he was as tall as what he portrays himself to be. The publisher also said that no, you cannot do black and white, it won't sell the book. Also one of their quirks, their marketing research says that flat black and white doesn't sell, though I personally am most attracted by that kind of cover, illustrated black and white. And so an artist friend brought in and said she'll do this. So she is also a weaver and an illustrator and a painter. So she brought in all her skills for this cover to use her weaving knowledge, and so she's put in traditional Indian modern designs onto this skirt. I wanted the other one, him as a drunkard lying on a chair as the front cover. But the designer said no, we need the girl at the front, that's what we sell the book. Yes, sir.
I have a very long, complicated two-part question. So firstly,
I'll have to take your mask off so that I can hear it better.
of course. So firstly, very interesting biography, really quirky guy. What, like I think in tweets, like what, if there is an essential John Lang, right? If there's something that permeates a lot of his art, his political activism, what has it, like, is there a little John Lang in you, in me, in the neighbor next door? What characterizes in a simple, like millennial compatible like way? How would you characterize sort of what drove this particular person, and how could or should it guide how I navigate my own life?
So Australians are smarter than that, than the tweets. They have just one word for him, larrikin, which basically means this boisterous kind of figure who's an angry but a fun-loving man, which is what I guess everybody wants to be, is angry at the establishment. And like I narrated his history, is coming from a certain background, a lower caste in Australia. So India is blamed for caste, but I think it very much existed in the British system as well, which is why you find all those names like locksmith or things like that. So he was a victim of the caste system in Australia, and he found suitable allies in Indians fighting against British imperialism, and that's where his anger comes from. And he is a man of both great subversion, great learning, and great partying. That's roughly the tweet.
Work hard, play hard, I think.
No, he wouldn't work hard in the way modern understanding of working hard is. He considers himself smart. You should have read the right things. You should know your Byron and Shakespeare and not read how to get slim in 30 days. So you could work hard reading how to get slim in 30 days also, right? He also wants to play the cat and same time prove that he knows his Lord Byron. So for example, there's this Gorham case which is going on in England. I also forgotten the details of the case now, it is so boring. There's this priest who got into some controversy and newspapers writing endlessly about him every day, and Lang, being the leading editor of India, was invited to write the lead for an English newspaper. So once again the writer in question, reporting this incident, says John Lang was of convivial habits, which again is for not a teetotaler. John Egshaw was his favorite brand. He read about the Gorham case all night, got bored of it, drank some more. In the morning, he wrote, "Damn the Gorham case!" ! And they were committed to whatever he gives has to be printed, so it had to be printed in that bigger font to accommodate the whole page. And that's in a way the beginning of tabloid journalism. So his working hard is not exactly a conformist style of working hard, but yes, of course, working hard.
And then for the second part, like in a more focused political sense, he sort of sought to work in a way within the system, right? He was opposed to the forms of British imperialism, but he studied under the schools of,
Sure.
that produced many of the greatest defenders of British imperialism, would fight in British imperial and also local courts within the subcontinent. He tried to resist and to change the system from within the system, which many of us who are involved in local activist circles are being asked to do today. Some see promise in such a strategy, some do not. Would you say this vote of resistance was basically effective to the aims he wanted, or would you perhaps say not so much?
He's angry because he knows he cannot achieve as much as he wants, which is why he would write in Urdu and give it to an Urdu newspaper and things like that. So he understands his limitation, that he's also seen as a British person by the Indians and as a rogue character by the British. So he calls himself an interloper quite aptly in this situation. But he knows he cannot do much. Still does a lot. I think the Press Act in India came because of people like him. The Press Censorship Act. I don't remember the name of the act exactly, which is during the end of his lifetime in the 1860s. Because there was nothing to censor before that. They thought that at least the English writers would be loyal subjects. Turned out otherwise. And which is why post-colonialism is not as easy a field as Edward Said would like us to believe in. Orientalism. So he did achieve a certain amount of sort of political success and had several collaborators in the characters that I mentioned, like Marion Crawford, ADDP, and people like these who had great sympathies towards the colonized and also believed in decolonization. But also his location in history is interesting, and our location in history is very different. Of course, there's some takeaway from that. He's not writing from within a democracy, situated within a democracy. He's writing against the Queen. But there is a certain kind of leeway, because the idea of nation state is not that strong. Militaries are still mercenaries, so you can still write about them. It's not attached to the idea of motherland or fatherland, which is so deeply entrenched now. So you could criticize the military, unlike now. Strange that with democracy you cannot criticize. If there are big institutions, there will be big corruption, I guess. They're much smaller in the 19th century. But you cannot. Similarly, the judiciary is also sacrosanct in many countries. You cannot call them out. You call them out very easily. While practicing as a lawyer, he was a sort of a mole, giving out all the information and saying that these judges, these lawyers are corrupt, and so on and so forth. and also calling out the system, its sloth and so on. So it's strange that within, say, an empire he was able to do this, which should be an inspiration for today's journalists and activists. But I also understand our location in history, and despite the fact that we live in democracies, there's much more technological news over us somehow than it was there. You were anonymous at that point of time if you wanted to, or even if you were vocal at the front, like John Lang, you had a certain moral right as an artist. So I think the moral right of an artist has sort of been taken away, it's declined. We're also talking from a time when Shelley declared poets are unacknowledged legislators of the world. So artists definitely had that sort of legitimacy and arrogance also to push their way through. They had the confidence that nobody would be able to touch them. I don't think in today's world artists have that kind of confidence or that kind of sanction from the state, which shows a decline in our sense. If it's a democracy by the people, we have delegitimized our own art, our own artists, which needs to come back.